put myself on. I could circulate these if you want to have the materials by email. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Tuuli Toivonen, and have to think about it a bit. I'm a university researcher, but then I'll be starting in the autumn as assistant professor of geoinformatics or applied geoinformatics at the University of Helsinki. So University of Helsinki is where we come from. Myself and Aija Kukkala, who will be participating in the workshop and the presentation as well. And we'll be talking and telling you about land use planning and conservation planning using a tool, a software called Zonation, which has been developed in the research group where we work at, which is called Conservation Biology Informatics Group, which is a part of Center of Excellence of Metapopulation Biology at the University of Helsinki, and it's sort of Center of Excellence of Finnish Academy. The group, I could show you our web pages, is a group of people of 11, 13 people, depending a bit how you count it. And our leader, so Professor Atte Moilanen, has been working for 10 years or more to develop the software that we are now presenting to you. And there are a bunch of other people, including geographers like ourselves, but then computer scientists, conservation scientists, economists, mathematicians, forest biologists, and so on. And there are several PhD students involved, and then postdocs and professors. So that's our group, and really what we would like to show you today is the Zonation software, which is something that could be fairly interesting for those who know spatial data sets of Europe and who somehow are involved in planning issues, either in environmental planning or conservation planning, but also in general land use planning, because the tool is useful for that purpose as well. So, as said, it has been developed for 10 years now, and there are several manuals, for example, and several versions which have been published. So now the most recent version, so version 4, is just out, and I could circulate the manuals if you want to have a quick look at it. There are some extra copies that we have with us, so in case you're really interested, so you can take one of those as well. It's a bit heavy, so that's why I'm saying that if you're really interested. And then there are more sort of thin brochures as well, which you can use and read in order to understand what the tool really does. Well, the funders are something which is often mentioned, so it needs to be mentioned that our work has been supported by very many different bodies, and it has been used in several different organizations in Finland, where we come from. Environmental agencies, Metsähallitus, which is the National Forest Agency, and then Finnish Environment Institute are both using the tool to make planning, but also in Australia, in Uruguay, in India, in US, New Zealand, South Africa, and in other countries it has been applied for conservation planning and land use planning. But if we talk about Europe and think about the issues that are really relevant, so I suppose it must be said that in Europe, of course, there are many actions at the moment ongoing to conserve biodiversity. And for example, if you take the most recent papers on biodiversity strategy, it is very evident that the European Parliament is worried about the loss of biodiversity, saying that it has devastating economic costs and costs for the society because of loss of biodiversity as such, but also because of loss of ecosystem services. And of course, land use change is one of the main drivers of the biodiversity crisis, and therefore all issues or all planning actions related to land use influence somehow also biodiversity and the things that we have been most interested in. And one of the recent trends in Europe is of course also green infrastructure and worries about that how to ensure green infrastructure and how to plan it so that it would be as extensive as possible, connected as possible, and providing services for the Europeans. And of course then there's the Inspire directive, which influences our work quite a lot, as it at least partially enables or adds access to different data sets which are really important for planning activities, such as the things that we have been developing, and for the tools that are data hungry, as this Zonation tool, for example, is, as you will see in our later examples. So the things that we are working on are related to data. So we are sort of data hungry. We need to have the data hopefully in high quality format, in harmonized format, and so that it's accessible. And we need to use it for land use planning, natural resource management, and conservation planning. And we work in an area, and the tool has been developed for an area which is in a way in a crossing of all these. So spatial conservation planning is the sort of theoretical framework where the tool has been developed, or to which the tool has been developed. So this is sort of our framework of working as a research group and as a tool developers. But before going to any further content, I would actually like to know that who you are, so that we can a bit direct the talk here. Because the idea of us is now that we'll have two different sessions. I don't know if you noticed that there are two workshop sessions of ours. Now this one and then next one after this. So we would like to know that how many of you are participating both sessions. So do you know yet? Or probably. So are there others who plan to participate only this one? If I ask it the other way around.
Unfortunately, I will have to go to.
Yeah. Okay, because then we can a bit adjust that what do we tell you now. But then, who are you? I know that it's not very handy as this is being recorded, but still I would like to know. Just a quick round, and where do you come from?
Yeah. Okay, I'm Javier, I'm from Spain, and I work developing software for analysis and visualization of data, and we work a lot on biodiversity informatics.
Okay, very good.
Hi, I'm Robin Hansen. I work for the Norwegian Hydrographic Service. So my big question is can we use some of the things that you have here for land, maybe for sea?
Okay, yes.
I'm Sabina Dimitriou. I'm from Romania, and I'm a member of the regional panel. We're working on strategies, integrated strategies for cities, but also for city regions, and in light of the new programs, which will be developed nationwide 2014-2020. We're really interested in finding out more about this tool.
Good.
I'm Bente Nielsen from the Danish Environmental Ministry.
Okay.
Lena Hallin from the Finnish Environment Institute. And I work quite a lot with land use planners on the regional level, and also with all kind of land monitoring data.
And I'm Elisa from the same institute in Lena, and my work is related to land monitoring issues.
Dirk Hinterland from Germany. I'm responsible for habitat mapping in North Rhine-Westphalia, that's part of Germany, and keeping the protected sites. And I was facilitator of the thematic working group of habitats and biotopes and species distribution and biogeographic regions.
Okay. Very interesting.
I'm Pauline Gobert from France. I'm working in a regional platform for the implementation of Inspire. I'm not directly concerned by this topic, but we work with all the producers of data in the Inspire axis, so we have to know another thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, hi, I'm Wolfgang Steinmann. I'm with the German Space Agency. I was seconded to the European Commission some years ago, and I was leading a group which managed the land monitoring service of the Copernicus observation program. So that's my relationship with land observation with many spatial planners and user groups. That's my interest from.
My name is Ad van Houten. I'm from the Dutch cadastre in the domain of cables and pipelines. I'm interested in the solution. Perhaps it might be interesting for other domains.
Hello, my name is Andreas Metru. I am working as software developer in the Spatial enabling technologies in Greece. And our main activities are developing open source solutions for Inspire and spatial data infrastructures. And I'm interested about the software of the presentation. So that's for me.
Yep. Good.
My name is Niklas Hagener. I'm from the Department of Geography of the University of Bonn in Germany. I work for the group of eco-hydrology and water resource management, and I focus on integrated river basin management. And in there we have a lot of topics included, and also all these topics there on this slide. So I'm interested in how you integrate all this in one system.
What about the last person still? Do you want to, in blue shirt? Do you want to introduce yourself still, or you in the back row?
Sorry?
Do you want to introduce yourself just so that we are doing a round so that we know that who's participating?
Okay. My name is David Brocho. I come from Croatia. Work for a company that actually produces software and support for government authorities. And we are working with GIS and land use spatial plans and things like that.
Okay, so very related. Nice to have you here. Thank you for your presentations. I think that the work that you're doing is somehow related to ours as well, which is really nice. Really, our idea is that we'll now explain in this session sort of broadly what Zonation does, but if the case is such that you'll be sort of participating only this session, so then we'll probably include on the fly some of the things that we were planning to put to the second session only, so to make some sort of demo as well, really briefly. So the second session is about more detailed demo, that how does the tool really work and how does it, what kind of data does it use and so on. And there are a couple of examples that we are going to go through in that. But first, some general principles of the tool and of the approach. So really it's not only a tool, it's more like a conceptual approach as well, having its background in conservation biology and in theories of fragmentation, for example, and ecology more broadly. So it's a tool for spatial conservation planning, but recently the part conservation has been put more and more to the brackets, because we've noticed with the examples of, for example, regional councils in Finland, that actually it's quite useful for general planning as well. But the idea overall in the usage of the tool usually is that there's a need to identify that how to target resources that are available, for example, for conservation or recreation or other land uses. So how to target them so that targeting would be effective. So where are the best places, best locations for putting different land uses or planning different land uses. And the question is, of course, where, so spatial question, but also there might be a temporal question, that when to do that, and we might want to know that why, like to explore the data a bit more, and even to understand that what implications there are if we do planning in a certain manner, so how effective the planning then is. So not only knowing spatial locations for a certain activity, but also being able to quantitatively measure that if we, for example, delineate an area for conservation or for recreational purposes, so what does it influence on the level of biodiversity protection, for example, or how does it influence accessibility of people around the facility, for example. So these sorts of questions are quite normal, and Zonation is used to make prioritizations and to understand a bit this why and where or when part as well. Usually it used or aims at creating ecologically sound solutions. So ecological and biological questions are in the heart of the tool, but taking into account also that what are the needs of individuals and citizens in the area which is being planned, with the idea that we need to use public money responsibly. So if we use, for example, money for conservation, so the idea is to identify that where that could be done most cost effectively without spending the the money in the wrong place, but still gaining a good result in conservation. What the tool actually does, I'll explain it a bit in more detail, but basically, as a general thing, it develops a spatial ranking for conservation or for other land uses. Anyway, for the matter that it's being used for. So the idea is to identify the best and the not so good areas for a certain purpose using spatial data sets as the input. And sort of balancing between the different input data, for example, different species, different habitats, or different land uses that are taken into account. So basically it aims at maximum retention of feature richness, so species richness or habitat richness or what have you, so that the species or habitats are weighted, but also that the range sizes, so their extent of their range is being taken into account in the process of prioritization. And the idea is that it balances between economy and ecology, so if there's ecological data, or usually there is ecological data available, but also if there's economical data available in a spatial format, so that can be taken into account to identify those areas that would be, for example, most cheap to protect or to take for recreational purposes, rather than taking the most expensive areas if the result from ecological point of view is just the same. As a tool, it is sort of a GIS tool, but not really. So for example, it doesn't use projections, it doesn't identify the projections of the data, or if the data sets are in different projections, it can't overlay them. So it doesn't have this facility because it has been developed from different background. But it takes as input GIS data in all standard GDAL raster formats, so TIFF or ASCII or IMG or what have you. And it's very efficient in making calculations in raster world. So sort of standard things that you could do in a GIS tool, say kernel density calculations or weighting calculations or connectivity transformations that would require quite a lot of work in a normal GIS tool are very easily done with Zonation. I'll explain that a bit later. It creates, for example, a set of input layers, weighted richness layers. So if we have, say, 25,000 layers of data, it creates as output richness layers which are weighted so that the weighting takes into account more heavily those species, for example, which have really small ranges, so that they get higher value, and species which are really extensive, occurring everywhere, they are weighted less. And this is one of the outputs of Zonation. And then it produces the prioritization, so the identification of the landscape, which are most of those parts which are most important, and then those which are less important, and then quantification that how do those priorities then, or priority areas, how do they perform in, for example, conserving different habitats or species. It can handle a very large number of rasters. As I said, that for example, 25,000 data layers is one number, so it's something that we have been now analyzing. I'll present you some of the results just in a minute. We've been doing global analysis with 1.5 kilometer resolution with 25,000 species and 800 ecoregions, and calculating the priority areas globally for biodiversity protection. So it can handle really large number of features and high resolution data. And what it does when creating, for example, these weighted richness layers or prioritizations is that it produces standard raster and text outputs, so that those can be again processed, for example, in a GIS software or in a statistical software if those are to be used. How it looks like is this. So it has a sort of graphical user interface, or it can be used from command line. We'll show this more closely to you later on. And what it is then used for most often is that it's used for recognizing ecologically valuable areas. So this is the main usage this far. It has also been used to recognize less valuable areas. I'll show you in a minute a peat bog extraction example where peat is being extracted in central Finland, and there was a need to identify that from where that peat should be extracted so that it would harm the least biodiversity, if there was a need to extract peat. So this is one of the common usages these days. Also, it is used for evaluating existing conservation areas. Aija will show you an example about Natura 2000 network and how that could be evaluated and is being evaluated at the moment with different species data. And for example, designing conservation area networks and extension is one of the common usages. And then more general land use planning is being active, or has been active more recently, in addition to these more traditional uses of zonation. So what it does in principle is that it tries to take into account the local habitat quality of a certain site, which is described in raster datasets. So if we have lots of raster data describing localities in the study area, it takes, of course, those information in the individual pixels account. Then it takes into account connectivity, so what is in the neighborhood of that one individual site. And connectivity can be defined in several different ways, depending on what you're interested in. So if you're interested in, say, fresh waters, so then connectivity patterns are, of course, very different than if you're interested in open landscapes. So then the sort of definition of connectivity becomes different, and zonation can take into account different types of connectivity. Sort of marine connectivity is something which it's not very good yet at. So having sort of open connectivity possibilities, but still so that they are directed, for example, because of sea currents, is something that has been planned but hasn't been implemented yet. But it has been used for marine cases as well. And then how it does it is that it really tries to take into account connectivity, the local conditions across several different species and environmental variables. And in addition to this ecological value, it tries to take into account economic value as, for example, land price, or then the level of threats. So if there would be information available about threats, or for example plans for urban expansion, then those could be integrated into the analysis so that those areas could be avoided in the prioritization, or they could be sort of favored in the prioritization if there's a need to, for example, place conservation areas close to urban expansion areas to create a buffer effect or buffer around these urban expansion areas, for example, for recreation or for protection, depending on the situation. Usually the process of using the tool is such that it's not about one tool in the end, actually. It's about setting the objectives. So what is the idea of, or what is the question that we need to answer? As in any case, when you're doing any spatial analysis for planning. So the first thing is, of course, to define that what you're after, and that influences how you will do the actual analysis. And then that, what is the objective, will influence that what data need do you have. And that influences that how do you need to process the data, how do you need to collect it, and then there are standard ways of doing pre-processing. So zonation eats one type of data, basically, so raster data. So you need to process the data so that it's in a format that suits the next step, which is the spatial prioritization, which here is done with zonation. And then as you get priority ranking out from the system and other information, so then quite often you need to do some post-processing in order to understand the results, that what do they really mean for your question and for the objectives that you have set for the analysis. And basically after the post-processing, visualizing and verification of the results, it might be that you have to add some data sets. You notice that the result is not good, or you need to modify the actual prioritization process somehow, as normally in any analysis. The process is iterative. But hopefully, in the end, you'll be able to produce recommendation for action of some sort. This is a work, by the way, you can't really see it maybe. by our colleagues Joona Lehtomäki and Atte Moilanen. So there's a more broad paper presenting the normal zonation analysis. So basically, you might want to collect and pre-process data on different species, say birch, spruce, pine and other deciduous, so different forest or tree species. This is now from southern Finland. Data which has been collected for national forest inventories and could be used for zonation to create this kind of priority ranking. Here you can see Helsinki, our capital, as low priority area, and then there are some national parks and parks in here which show up with high biodiversity and priorities because of their species richness, and then you can see the overall pattern of high priority areas or low priority areas in the region. And in addition to that map and some other maps that it produces these performance curve presentations showing that how well the different proportions of the landscape are able to protect or cover different proportions of these feature ranges. So if you have different features as inputs, you are able from these performance curves to say that the best 20% of the landscape, for example, has now 40% on average of the ranges of those input features covered. So it has been able to prioritize so that the top 20 covers a certain amount of the features. And with these you can analyze fairly well that how well does the priority work in terms of your input data or prioritization. So these link these maps and these curves in a way that for example the red areas on the map are the same percentages in here. So say if we have for example the best two percentages as red on the map, so then these are the areas in the performance curves. And this is important if you want to understand the results, because those performance curves are containing most of the most important information of how does the prioritization work in terms of the biodiversity features, whereas the map provides the spatial information on where the top priorities or low priorities are. And what does zonation actually do at its simplest is that it takes, say, three different biodiversity features, for example, three different plants as input and their ranges. It might also be abundances or whatever, so there might be a range of values involved, but this is now binary data, just to keep the example simple. And then it rasterizes it, or it needs to be rasterized beforehand, so the data is being rasterized so that you have cells having values yes or no, so true or false for all of these species. And then how zonation continues is that it gives first the value, for example, if this would be the input data, that these would be really binaries, so then these are calculated or changed to values that correspond to the importance of individual pixel. So if we have really broad-ranged species, then the importance of this individual pixel is smaller than if we have a species having a smaller range. So then each of these pixels have higher weight in a way, because the species is more rare. And then it puts these together. This is now very simplified. And then it calculates the overall points for each pixel. So sums up with the different features and their representation, and then it removes the one which is least important. And now it removes that one, the gray one there, because it's least connected. So it had lowest value, but there are other options as well, but it removes the least connected one. And then what it does then is that it again ranks the pixels, and as that one species changed, and the range changed as one pixel was removed, so then it needs to recalculate that what is the weight for individual pixel now. And it iterates this through all the pixels and through all the species in the data, and therefore it tries to identify that what are the most important areas in the landscape. And in addition to this really simple prioritization that it does over thousands of features, if you wish, So it tries also to make, or can be used to make, connectivity analysis, so connectivity transformations to different features. So for example, you could weight in the process those areas which are close to other species. So if you would like to identify areas that are sort of good for several different species, so you could weight them with the neighborhood or with the existence of other species in the neighborhood. Or you could identify the core areas for individual species. So you could say that if there's a patch of a habitat or a species, so the core area is more important. So you could make a distribution smoothing or kernel transformation to that and use that. Or you could make connectivity analysis so that you avoid harmful features. So if there's, for example, land use which is harmful for other activities, biodiversity or for recreation or for something else, you could calculate negative connectivities so that the prioritization avoids those areas which are somehow harmful. Or then if there's a recreational area in the vicinity, you could weight so that if you are close to an existing recreational area, so then your data gets more weight. So these sorts of connectivity transformations you can do to make the analysis more complete. Also, you could make condition transformations. So if you have, for example, data on existing habitats or species, but then you have information that the landscape has been degrading. So then you could apply spatial data on the degradation. So for example, the intensity of land use as one condition, trying to discount the existence of existing features, so that all the features, even if there are thousands of those, are discounted with land use, for example, so that you get more sort of true image of what there is in the landscape or in the study area. You could make hierarchical analysis, meaning that it's possible to, for example, understand that what is the value of current protection, current recreational areas, and then the rest of the landscape, for example. Or you could analyze separately for different administrative units. So you could make a global prioritization across your study area, but if there are, for example, municipalities that should have equal responsibility, for example, in protection, or should have equal responsibility in creating recreational areas, so then you could say that prioritize so that each of the municipalities get a certain amount of high priorities, which is quite useful. I'll show you a couple of examples of zonation quite briefly. So one of these very traditional biological examples is, for example, lecking sites for capercaillie. So those are the areas where capercaillies reproduce. And I took this as an example because it's so easy to understand. And then we'll go to land use, more land use related examples. So there was an idea that in southern Finland, where there's really lots of pressure from urban sprawl, even, or urban expansion, capercaillie, which is an endangered species, is occurring there, and it was important to find out that where are the top areas for this species, which is sort of umbrella species for other species as well. So it can be used as an indicator of important sites for biodiversity in general, as it likes old growth forests and those which are quite far away from urban settlements. And here the idea was to try to identify the suitable forests for capercaillie, try to sort of identify the negative impact of land use. There was the idea of trying to weight between different features, so there were different input features from the forestry data, and as capercaillies like conifer forests, so conifer forests were weighted more in the analysis. And also connected landscapes are quite appreciated by the bird, so therefore connectivity needed to be taken into account. And there was a set of different forest quality measures from national forest inventories as spatial data. Then the weight on conifers was applied, and then connectivity and avoidance of people with National Population Registry was included in there. And how zonation analysis then performed was that it identified several different priority areas for capercaillie, and these spots here were such where field work was carried out, and interestingly the species was found from all of those places, which were identified as the high priority from the analysis. And then those lacking areas really exist. It was known already in beforehand that these are such that are where the bird has been observed, that they overlap with the priorities and also with the later made fieldwork site. Then another quick example is also from Finland, inverse spatial conservation prioritization from central Finland, where this peat bog extraction was in place. So there was a need to identify 7,000 hectares of land for peat bog extraction in the regional council of central Finland and by the planning authorities. And the idea was to try to identify the areas where least harm would be made for species and ecosystems, but still that the extraction would be sort of economically justified, so that would be producing peat as well. And there the different inputs were different biodiversity features describing the biodiversity value. Basically this was habitat level information from peat bogs. Then there was data on potential for peat extraction, that what kind of areas are suitable for that. And then the analysis the idea was that the analysis takes into account the impact of peat extraction as well, so that there's negative connectivity to peat extraction areas, which is being considered. And there was a sort of ecological model or sort of analysis model developed to this purpose, so that it could combine ecosystem types, ecosystem condition, peat mining potential, endangered and rare species, and bird territories for the area. And for zonation analysis, it really did the hierarchical ranking, taking all these features into account. There's again a paper describing this more in detail, so maybe I don't go to details now as time is flying. But what it was able to produce was the standard curves for performance, and this time what was not interesting was this part. So this was the area that people of course wanted to avoid, the best areas for biodiversity, but rather the areas where there was least potential for or value for biodiversity were the ones which were considered most potential for peat bog extraction. And when this is converted to a map, this is something that was made with planning units. So you can make the analysis with pixels, as I explained earlier, but also with planning units, so that you have all the data from just individual units. And here a planning unit was used. So the red ones are the ones with high biodiversity value, and the blue ones are the ones with high peat production value. And this information was then useful for decision makers, as it was combined with the information on the biodiversity protection level with the reddish areas, and then the peat bog extraction potential for the blue areas with lowest priority in biodiversity terms. Then still a brief example of global scale analysis. How we plan to do our examples here is that whereas these two were quite local, there's now one global example which I'll show you briefly, and then Aija will tell more about European analysis. And then on the next block we'll show one thing which is from southern Finland, which is linked to land use planning more directly. But this is something that we have been now working on for a year or so, very intensively, and the work was submitted to Nature last Monday. So yesterday I was here already, so I wasn't submitting it, but it's work that is being done by myself and Fede Montesino-Pusols, who's a Spanish guy working in our group, and all the rest as well. And the idea has been to identify for global protected area expansion those areas that should be taken into conservation, taking into account land use change. So we have been getting land use change models from the University of Amsterdam, and then also the fact that quite often planning is made on a national scale rather than global scale. So if we make a global analysis that where are the top areas for biodiversity protection, so then the result is quite different than if we take an analysis on a national scale. And we wanted to see the discrepancy between those. And of course the background in this is that there's this CBD, so conventional biological diversity, and it has these new IG targets, and IG target 11 says that 17% of terrestrial land should be taken for conservation by 2020, meaning that there's a huge need for identifying that which land areas those would be, especially in countries where this protection target is not yet met. So what we wanted to find out with the analysis was that what is the potential of the expanded protected area network at its best, if we try to identify the best areas, so how those perform in terms of species and ecoregions, and how land use change by 2040 will change the pattern and will impact. And also that what if we really do the planning and implementation at national scale in comparison to global scale, so what does it mean for biodiversity protection. And what we did, which is more like describing the normal zonation process, so even if you're not interested in global analysis, this gives an idea that what can be done. So basically we took the areas or ranges of 25,000 red listed species and sampled those or rasterized those to scale of 1.5 kilometers at the equator. And then we took ecoregions, land use data, current protected areas and country borders, and used zonation to make an analysis and get priority maps and performance curves out of that. And here you can see the top priority areas for protection. So these reddish areas are the ones that should be or could be taken into protection. As you can see from Europe, there's not too many areas in there because there's already so much protection that the 17% target is met in a way, and also in a global scale the biodiversity is not so rich in higher latitudes, and of course the most emphasis is on the tropics and in Europe, in southern Europe. And if we see that how is the performance of these proposed areas or this priority ranking, first of all we can see that 11%, which is currently being protected in the world approximately, is able to cover 21% of the species ranges that were analyzed, which is fairly okay. But if we are able to expand optimally to 17%, we could be gaining 3 times more biodiversity protection. And if we consider land use change, there's a small drop, but not huge. You can see the drop more in there, where the whole landscape has been considered. So there we can see that there's approximately 10% or 13% drop in overall level of biodiversity. So 61% could be gained, more protection in a way could be gained with the 17% expansion, or 54% if the land use scenarios really take place. There's a global loss, and then there's a question that because of the global loss and land use change, should we actually raise the target of conservation? So should we protect even more in order to keep the same potential level of biodiversity protection? Then if we do the analysis on a national scale, you can see with blue color, or maybe with green color first, you can see the global priorities that were presented in the previous map. So the 17%, these are just spatial datasets that Zonation outputs, which you can then process as whichever GIS layers. So now we have been extracting the best 17% out of the priority map, and the green areas are the global priority areas, the bluish areas are the national priority areas, and you can see that there's a clear sort of border effect in the sense that in Russia, for example, many of the the biodiversity-rich areas are in the south, so they tend to sort of collect to the southern borders, always towards the tropics. And the red areas are the overlapping areas, which are really tiny. So the overlap is fairly small, indicating that actually if we make the planning at national scale, we are not able to reach the global priorities too well. There are some areas where that happens, but not too many. And if the planning is made at national scale, so then what we are able to reach is really 43% of the current ranges only, or 38% of the future ranges of species with the expansion, in comparison to the 61% that was possible if doing the planning in a global scale. And these are important things, of course, in a way that if you are able to analyze either global issues or very local issues with this manner, that you get out a map where you can identify the best areas, and then you can get out performance curves indicating that what is the performance of those top areas. It's quite easy to understand that what do different actions influence, or how do different actions influence, because you can, instead of the future land use as we used here, you could use also future plans and see that how do the plans, for example, impact the results. Maybe I don't go to those examples. I'll invite Aija here to show one European analysis about Natura 2000 network. In case you, by the way, have any questions, so now would be, for example, a good time. Or later.
Okay, hello everybody. My name is Aija Kukkala, and I have recently started a PhD at the University of Helsinki at the Conservation Biology Informatics group. And I'll introduce you some of the stuff that can be done with zonation in the context of Europe. So why Europe? In my opinion, Europe is very fascinating and interesting continent because we have a long-term human impact on the environment. We have intensive land use change happening, but also we have a lot of data available. And in the sense of collaboration in Europe, it's exceptional in the context of EU. And Natura 2000 network is a good example of how the countries are working together. So here is the workflow of spatial prioritization in zonation. For a reminder, Tuuli already showed you an example of this. So at first you have to think about the objectives and ecological model and pre-process the data. The data can be divided to environmental and social data sets. So zonation can be used data about habitats, species, or ecosystem services. And some of the examples from social or socioeconomic data sets can include threats, costs, and also current plans or planning documents. So our questions here are: what kind of data can be used in zonation analysis in the context of Europe? And how INSPIRE process can benefit spatial conservation planning in general? And how do data choices and data quality influence spatial prioritization results in principle? And I also have an example about how continental versus national planning affect on biodiversity priorities. So at first I will talk about spatial data resources in Europe and how they can be applied in spatial prioritization. And after that, I'll show you some examples about zonation analysis in Europe. So all of you probably know about Inspire and the data teams in it, and they are divided to 3 annexes. All of these data teams can be used in spatial conservation planning and spatial prioritization. So they are really important input for us doing zonation analysis. And here is an example how data sets can be conceptually thought in spatial prioritization and how they can be divided in different categories. For example, you can consider data by teams, and the most common in zonation framework is biodiversity features, species habitats, ecosystem services, and other data sets such as anthropogenic data, but land cover, administrative borders and land use and so on. And then you can think data from the perspective of data origin and data type. And zonation can take observation data, projected or modeled or presence-absence data as input, and many other kinds of data as well. The third theme or category that you can think of data is data usage. Some of the data you can directly use as zonation input, for example, species distribution data. But some of the data you have to think at first and how to use it in the context of zonation analysis. And you can use it as a potential derivative data. And one of the main European data sets, Corine land cover, is such a data set you can use, but you have to at first think how to really use it in zonation. And costs can be applied also in zonation analysis, as Tuuli already mentioned. So the starting point for the analysis is, of course, the setting the objectives and creating your ecological model. You have to think at first what would be appropriate analysis extent for your analysis. What is really the available data you have? And then you have to think about the prioritization method. Zonation has several methods, and what would be the best for your analysis. And then the fourth question is, do you have a need to weight some features, for example, threatened species or something like that? And also you have to think, is there some kind of connectivity to be considered in the analysis? So here is a little bit repetition from Tuuli's presentation about the pre-processing of the data. So as a reminder, the pre-processing is really a big thing in zonation analysis. Zonation takes only raster data as input, and it doesn't recognize any projections, so you have to have the same extent and same cell size for your data. And then comes the second part, the real spatial prioritization, which is really time-consuming part as well. And after that, you have to start to analyze the output result visualization, verification, and how to interpret your output. And after that, you can think about what kind of recommendations can be suggested for conservation actions, for example. Here are the data sets used in the following zonation examples in the context of Europe. So I have used species data, which is INSPIRE Annex 3 data, actually. I've used data about amphibians, birds, mammals, and reptiles. So I have 4 groups of species, and other data about these species are from Wilfred Tullier's laboratory, from University of Grenoble, and open data as a comparison is used or taken by IUCN Red List species. And the second data set I have used here is Natura 2000 data, and which is described or used as protected areas from Annex 1. And for administrative regions, I've used country borders here, and the 2 other data sets are Corinne, land cover, and the last one is biogeographical regions, which is already one spatial data team in INSPIRE. So, at first, here you can see the impact of analysis area. The red describes the top priorities, and in the left you can see the prioritization result map from EU countries, so EU 28, and the second one is in the extent of biogeographical regions. Here you can see how the top priorities are situated differently because of the analysis area is different. So for example, here in the EU map, Finland gets more top priorities than from another solution. So eastern species gets higher priority here because of the smaller analysis area. And the second result is about the prioritization method. Zonation has several different methods available, and for example here is additive benefit function, ABF, which seeks for a really balanced solution, and the second one has more emphasis on rare species. It's called core area zonation. And the priorities get a little bit different locations in these prioritization methods used here. There is a lot of details about the prioritization methods here in the manual and also in the quick start manual, which are available there if you are more interested in. And the second result of analysis is about hierarchical analysis. And Tuuli already mentioned about how you can use this kind of a setup in zonation. In here, I have used it with Natura 2000 data. Here is a prioritization done with EU countries. This is a simple version or solution without any hierarchical mask used. And the right solution is prioritization made with Natura 2000 network as a hierarchical mask. And in here, you can also see how the top priorities shown in red gets a bit different locations. So in the right map, the top priorities are in the Natura 2000 network, and here they are done without any hierarchical forest solution for it. Next, I'll show you the performance curves for the same analysis. So here you can see there is this strange kind of curve that tells you how the prioritization with Natura 2000 is described or shown in red line, and the prioritization without any hierarchical mask is shown in blue. With this kind of analysis, you can evaluate or examine already or you can examine the current protected areas, how they are doing, or for example, in here you can see that this Natura 2000 network covers about 18% of Europe land area, and now you can see here its species range are protected on average 30% of their landscape. And with this kind of analysis, you can also examine what could be the potential expansion areas for this protected area network. So the areas here, right after the Natura 2000 network mask, what kind of areas are there? So it's kind of a useful thing to do as well. And one analysis which can be also applied in Europe, in the context of Europe, is administrative units analysis, which tries to evaluate how national or continental conservation planning is, or trying to compare national or continental conservation planning. Here is the same prioritization for EU countries, and then you can see the prioritization map done with the administrative units as countries. And as you can see, the priorities gets really different locations with the admin units analysis. So the priorities are shifting towards south and towards country borders. It's so-called edge effect. And here is also a performance curve for this national versus continental analysis. And as you can see, there is a small drop from the optimal or ideal solution, which is this shown in blue, and the prioritization solution with administrative units in green. And the one analysis which I find really interesting is how to add land cover data in Zonation. So here I have used Corin-derived data as land use intensity layer, and we had to do a little bit data preparation before this analysis. So we gave scores to Corin classes, land cover classes, according to how natural state the environment is. So the values were reclassified from 0 to 1. And we created this so-called condition layer. So here is the map. You probably all recognize which area this is. So this is France. And this solution is done without the condition layer or transformation. And the second one here is done with the land use intensity layer. So, sorry. So in the map here, or solution which doesn't have this condition layer, somehow the west coast of France gets really high priority. And with the condition on, the priorities are shifted away from urban areas or areas of intensive agriculture. For example, this area here on the west coast gets higher priority than in this solution. So it's a forest area, which is probably in very natural state. It's really interesting to see how the priorities are shifted from when you use the condition layer in the zonation analysis. Okay, finally, about the data sources and how they affect on the results. So this is a preliminary analysis, and I have made this comparison based on private, non-open data and openly accessible data. So I have used this private Wilfred Juliers data about amphibians, birds, mammals and reptiles, and it's habitat corrected and made with really high resolution. And the second data set used this IUCN red list. And they are resampled to the same resolution. And here you can see how different the result can be when you use different kind of data sources. And there is an even better example how the data impacts on results. But this is the IUCN data, and the picture, the map in the right is Juliers, made with Juliers data. Okay, a few sentences about conclusions. As we all know, data quality and data services are crucial. They are crucial also for spatial conservation planning and spatial prioritization. And if you have more harmonized high-resolution data and consistent data, it covers all areas of interest, you probably get more high-quality results. And data policy is also a very interesting and important thing. And as you know, we are in the Inspire conference, and international collaboration is really vital. And we have really an exceptional potential to take advantage of it in the EU and Inspire process. And a few words about spatial conservation planning. Coming or future land use change and policy emphasis may change conservation needs really much. And zonation is a tool that can help balance the needs of species, habitats, ecosystem services and other land uses. But conservation is also one land use, which is in kind of a competitive with other alternative land uses. And cost efficiency is also a thing to keep in mind and should be considered in prioritization. And as I already said, or Tuuli said, alternative choices in prioritization and data can lead major differences in proposed priorities, as you already all saw. And high quality data enables combining spatial conservation planning with general land use planning. And this is what zonation also can be helpful for regaining. And spatial conservation planning is one of the beneficiaries of the Inspire process. Okay. But not yet to the coffee break, I guess.
Yeah.
We have 20 minutes.
Yeah, sure.
When you were using Graphical dataset,
Mm-hmm.
and current classification includes very a lot of mixed classes. So which were the most difficult classes
Well,
when you were evaluating this nature value source?
Well, actually, I think that the work presented here is in a process where Korean land cover should be considered more carefully even. So there was a preliminary test on how to do the conditioning, but I think that in order to do it really properly, so it needs to be made as an expert effort to identify the different condition values or the different intensity values. So I don't know what would have been the most difficult one. At least there are all these sort of meadow classes which are quite difficult to define. Agriculture is difficult as well. There are classes like fruit and berry plantations. I think it's something like that in English, isn't it? So whether that's natural or whether it's not natural depends very much on the area where you are, or whether it's really intensive or near natural, or so. So those are very difficult ones. You could use Korean land cover two ways in analysis, I think. So you could identify some of important sites from there. So areas which could be considered as biodiversity features, like you have urban greens there. So you might want to have those as something that you take as sort of element in prioritization. Or then you could use it as a condition layer, sort of really lowering the value in those areas which have really high or intense land use. So those are the ways that you could use it, but it's challenging for sure. And
we really need an expert opinion.
Yeah. Quite often it's so that while these are sort of computational tools, they are the choices that you made, and why we wanted to emphasize the process is that actually it's dependent on what you want to have and what you want to identify, and that again is something where you need quite a lot of expert sort of discussion. Yes.
Yeah, also on this data question, are you aware that Copernicus has in the meantime produced, in addition to Corinne, which is rather coarse, aggregated to 25 hectares per pixel, so-called high-resolution layers, which are aggregated to 1 hectare resolution, and they're available for soil seeding of forests, some forest parameters, for agriculture greenland, and for wetlands, and for water surfaces. So these are 1 hectare data for all of Europe, including Turkey and all areas you might consider. And for urban areas, even finer data set is available, which is called Urban Atlas in a quarter hectare quality, but that does not cover the whole of Europe. It might cover 25% of European surface with the emphasis on urban areas.
Yeah, we are aware of both of those data sets, and the Urban Atlas is something that we have been considering, but as it's only for the cities over 100,000. Yeah.
I would say almost 30% of Europe is covered.
Yeah, which is fairly good. And the Copernicus data is something that we have been discussing, but haven't been yet testing or anything. So I started with the Natura 2000 analysis 2 weeks ago or something, and we had Korean land cover data available, and we, as sort of creating the zonation process is such that you need to develop set of setups where you usually develop them so that you first have very simple data sets as inputs and then you develop it further. Individual data layers can be replaced later on, and we wanted to have the framework ready first, and then I suppose that the data sets that you just described produced by Copernicus could be useful sort of alternative for Corinne, so I think that that's a very valid point. Thank you for that. We haven't tested yet that. I thought that briefly I could show, because we speeded up a bit our presentations in order to have time for this as well, so I could show you briefly that how does it work in practice. So this is the user interface of Zonation that you can see in here. And basically the idea is that you can create projects, so this is something that we'll show in the next session. So you can use a project maker to create a project, or then you can create the project just typing manually setup files. And the example that I would like to show to you is something from southern Finland. There's a regional council, system of regional councils in Finland doing regional level planning. And the regional council of southern Finland and Helsinki is doing now a new plan with one emphasis area in green areas, so green infrastructure. And we have been participating in that process in trying to create background analysis using zonation and combining different information. And basically that means that we have created a setup, or first of course the spatial datasets. This is now some preliminary work which I'll show you. This is, by the way, a dataset or a package that, in case you are interested in our work more in detail, we have sticks. You can copy this or we can send it to you, having different example datasets, different projects, zonation software as well, and the manuals as PDFs, a bunch of articles as PDFs, and then our presentations here. So let us know, or if you have been writing your emails to the paper that was circulating there, we can as well send these to you. But here we have some exercises or examples, and the Southern Finland case has data. So spatial datasets, masks, biodiversity features, ecosystem services, condition, so land use data, and then regional plans included. And these are just TIFF. We have, for example, for forests, some description, and then birch forest, other deciduous forests, pines, and so on. So a spatial layer describing these, or abundance of these different forest types and their quality, so that it's a combination of abundance of these birch individuals, for example, plus their age. So the abundance has been weighted with their age, so that the more older the forest is, the higher the biodiversity value is. So this is the idea with the forest data. And then we have species data, for example, threatened species data there, and then some data on specific species and so on. And then we have a bunch of ready-made zonation setups in Z projects folder here, sort of advancing set of setups. So from the very simple ones, taking only habitat data, to the more advanced ones, taking into account habitat, species, current plans, land use intensity, and making also connectivity transformation, so that, for example, a birch forest is more valuable if it's neighbored by spruce forest or other deciduous forest. So if there's deciduous forest around the birch forest, so then we can think that there's more connectivity between quite similar land uses, whereas if there's a similar patch of birch forest surrounded by intensive agriculture, so then the value of that wouldn't be as high in the condition transformation. And I could run just one of these examples so that you can see that how does it look like. Maybe I'll get it running and then I'll explain more, because it takes a while. So I'll open a project from there. Then it opens here. We can see all the details in here, but I'll put it running. And as it's running, so it's now reading information from here, having a set of files. For example, one of the interesting things is the species list file, having the weights given to different features, having different parameters for connectivity, and then pointing to these different spatial datasets. So all these spatial datasets are read to the analysis process, weighted, and used in prioritization in quite an advanced manner in this example, because here we consider, for example, interaction connectivity. There's one layer describing harmful land use, so we try to avoid that. And the interactions table defines, for example, that how that is being done. Then there's a connectivity matrix being applied, so that really these habitats which are similar to each other are giving more, or connectivity gives more value to them, and so on. And now Zonation reads the inputs in here and processes these. So now it's going on peatlands and doing the transformations. So it's calculating kernel densities and other transformations that are being made for the spatial data. And you can output these results. So if you think that in GIS you could use the same types of analysis, for example, kernel density calculations, and make those as pre-processing steps. So you can do that, or then you can integrate those parts in zonation analysis. And now it has been doing all the different transformations, connectivity analysis, and now it started the prioritization work. And once it's doing that, I can see it on a map as well. So the area which is now being prioritized, you can see the blue color is the least priority areas. This is now the southern Finland around Helsinki. So basically this area. Our capital is there in Peninsula, and then we have the southern Finland region somewhere here. And as the streets show, these are the most intensively populated areas, or densely populated areas. And then there are some protected areas located in here, or national parks, which should, if our data is correct, be of higher priorities. At the same time, when the map evolves here, what is evolving as well are the curves. So we can see the best performing features in here, the average of features, and then the lowest performing features presented in the curve. And what it does, in addition to just drawing these in here, is that it writes, Zonation writes a text file describing the performance of all the different features in this prioritization. So it produces one map with the priorities, then another map having the species or feature richness presentation in it, so that it can be used as well, that where are the richest areas in terms of weighted range size rarity. And then it produces text files that could be used for further statistical analysis. And then these can be of course sort of visualized as you like in here, or then taken to a GIS software. So for example, in ArcGIS you could then extract the best or the least important areas and use those as polygons later on for overlay analysis or what have you, in what do you need to do. Or then in zonation even you could make sort of merged map analysis. So if you make several different analyses or prioritizations after another, change for example individual things in the analysis, such as the prioritization method, or including different features, for example whether you want to include recreational information in this or not. So then you could, with the merged map option, see that how did the results differ spatially. With the curves you can see that how do they differ in terms of the sort of prioritization performance, and with the merged map or with GIS tool you can see that how do they differ in terms of spatial locations. So here this develops. And here you can see part of the outputs which is being used for the performance curves later. So the percentages of landscape evaluated, and then the amount of species and individual features which are in those percentages. What is interesting in this example now is that I used an example having a hierarchical mask in there. So having one layer with protected areas, planned green areas, and then all the rest of the landscape. And from the result, we can see that how well do the current protected areas perform in this area or in this region in terms of habitats, which are now the forest habitats, and traditional rural biotopes and agricultural land. Then how well we are able to avoid harmful land use, which is here considered to be very intensive land use. So, for example, ports, what are the sort of sand extraction sites, dump sites, and so on. So those are being avoided. And you can see that, for example, the current planned conservation areas or green areas, recreational areas are getting really high priority because we are making this hierarchical analysis, which is sort of expansion analysis on its other name. And there we see that the current protected areas perform fairly well. The recreational areas, the next bump there, add more to the protection level of these features that were included, and then they rise after that, and this can be analyzed in more detail with additional tools. So there are interactive plot option, for example, to make an analysis, for example, only for rural biotopes. And how the output is now, if we see it from here. So this is what we get as output. So one JPEG, just a simple image with horrible traditional zonation colors. There were no cartographers involved at this stage when these colors were defined. So a TIFF file which would be used in GIS, and then the weighted range size normalized rarity map which you could use. And then curves files and so on, which can be used to evaluate the performance of the overall solution and of different species or features involved in the analysis. So this was really quick demo of how zonation works to the end, and this is what we'll be showing in more broadly in the next session. So we'll go through this Southern Finland analysis and describe that how were the datasets processed, what datasets did we use and why, and then that how does it then work in zonation in practice. So feel free to come at 4 o'clock if you're interested. Yeah.
That is an interesting concept for land use planning. I know zonation systems from the insurance industry. For instance, in Germany, the Association of Insurers, they have this Zürich zonation for inundation risks and heavy rain risks. And from that system, they calculate their subscription fees. So it's a totally different purpose. But is there any overlap or cooperation as far, at least as the methodology is concerned? Because these are similar, as far as I can judge.
Yeah, not as far as I would know. So how this tool has been developed is very much from the conservation perspective originally, but then it has been noticed that actually for example, tourism planning in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, it's used quite a lot nowadays to identify the most attractive tourist sites and to plan for those as well. But for insurance companies and for this kind of risk evaluation, I don't remember that it would have been used, but it might be that I don't recall. But for sure there are, yeah, would be. And also, as you were thinking about the marine example, so for example in New Zealand there's an extensive project which has been taking place in doing marine planning. The sad thing though was that there was a result that with careful planning of locating the best 10% of the conservation areas in marine context, you could protect, was it 97% of marine species without losing any industrial value for fishing, but still the decision didn't take place according to that analysis, but it was something that the Fishermen's Association suggested. So you can plan, but then the politics are a different thing.
Yeah, I have one question. Species are endangered for several reasons. Some of them even are dependent on land use, on certain land use. if you have a list of endangered species, how do you deal with one species being extensive agricultural use, land use being relevant for the next species not? How does that work? To me, it seemed as if the species list comes as a block, so to say, and is rendered with or processed with land use, different land uses.
Yeah, you have a very good point there. So in our global analysis, for example, we did sort of standard processing for all the species, which were 25,000, which is not, of course, ecologically correct.
Yeah.
So it was a practical thing that we couldn't define the specific land use requirements for all the species, although that's the thing that should be done. In more local scale, and when there's more detailed information available, you could apply the discounts because of land use, or the sort of, what would be the opposite of discount, sort of the raising the value because of land use. So you could do that individually for different features, so for different species or for different habitat types or ecosystem services. So the list of these condition transformations is such that you define it for each input feature. You define a separate condition layer if you so wish. So that's very possible. Yes.
So I'm just curious about the in France, there, southern France, computing the naturalness of each cell. So that's a function of the Corey land use, where every land use category has a naturalness score.
Yeah, that was sort of.
A function of I guess, also a function of the density.
Yeah, so developing a proper sort of condition layer that would decrease the value on the basis of intensity of land use would be more complex process than what we have done here. So there we used only the Korean, and we gave values of intensity, but there are these mixed land use cases and national differences and so on. So actually you can't really do that on a legal.
Set score per classification rather than a weighted score based on classification plus density.
Yeah, in this case it was, but it could be much more detailed. So you could create it as well as you could. Yeah. Yeah. Yes.
Have you any plans to try and get the results of this into policy or implementation plans or anything like that?
Sure. So, well, depending on the case. So, for example, many of the cases that we have been working with in our group are such that are directly related to, for example, planning issues in our country or in other countries, so that they feed directly political decisions, so that the maps are being processed so that they could be understood by politicians as well, and the numbers. For example, sort of forest conservation planning system in Finland is nowadays such that you have private landowners donating their land, or it's bought from the landowners to expand the protected area network, and the tool has been used to identify that from who we should buy the land from to allocate the resources best. So it's very sort of practice related. For the European examples, it's something which is now has just started, and the discussions are starting with different bodies there. So our goal is, of course, to provide something which would be useful for and policy relevant. That has been the case in Sub-Saharan Africa, very much in Uruguay, where we have been participating in different processes, in South Africa specifically. And now for the global analysis, we are participating in the big IUCN conference in November in Australia, which is organized every 10 years. And the research director of IUCN was really keen on seeing our results, because it's indicating that really there's a need for international collaboration when planning the protected area network. But I wonder whether Aija wants to add something on the European case specifically.
No, it's really recently started.
Yeah.
Developing the ideas. And if you have any suggestions or comments, I'd like to hear.
Yeah.
About the data or anything else.
So I would think that this is the kind of stuff we should be presenting to DG Environment or Regio or
Yeah.
EEI policy.
Yeah, we plan and hope to do so. The funny thing at the moment in academia is, of course, that our main goal is to produce publications, and in addition to that, we would like to do the presentation of these to European sort of decision makers. What would be the best way of doing it is something that we are now planning and thinking. But for example, participation in any discussions on whoever you're working on those themes would be of course very valuable.
There is the EIONet, the European network, and there is a specific group that would be very interested in this called Land Use and Spatial Planning, the USP group. And that is, in my opinion, the appropriate place to show your results and to have discussion around that.
Yeah.
You should talk to Stefan Jensen, he's here.
Okay, very good.
You know him?
No, not, yeah. Okay.
He's from the EA.
Okay. Yeah, EEA is something that we sort of targeted. Now, none of you were from EEA. They are having, yeah, JRC, you were second. Where did you, yeah. So basically, we targeted in a way EEA people when coming here, also for interest of Inspire. But now EEA is organizing their own session at the same time, now and then at the same time with the next one as well. So that's our challenge now to capture everyone. We have been working on very sort of national scale and then on global scale, and now we hope to do stuff in Europe. So that's the plan.
One last comment. Since I've been working with the thematic working group on species distribution and habitats distribution for the Inspire data specification, I'm quite aware that we have little data. And even if, and you said you found places by your analysis, you found places where the biologists later found this Urogallus species. So you must be prepared to work with species and habitats distribution data that are very sparse. There are a lot of places where you have no knowledge whether a species is there or not. You have information that species is there because someone with expertise went there. And you can follow the route of his excursion on the map, seeing that somebody. So these are problems you have to deal with, and in my mind, you have to be very, very, very aware and very, very careful with that.
Yeah, and when interpreting the results, that is very correct. So if you see, for example, this Tullier's data, which is very detailed data and should be of very high quality over Europe. So, for example, Paris is highlighted there, and we don't know whether it's because Paris would really have species-rich areas. So is there, for example, the botanical gardens which have sort of high species richness, or is it just sort of bias because of observations? And all these things do influence the results, and that is indeed something that we have to be very careful when interpreting the results. We can take them to some level into account in the analysis, but even more we need to take those into account when interpreting these maps.
Even more so in the ocean.
Yeah, that's for sure. That from the ocean you have even poorer data sets than from land. Okay, thank you very much for your comments and participating. In case you're interested, by the way, so there are those. Yeah, good.
Clear from the map that there is a bias because this sort of shape that you can see here has nothing to do with geography. And this one is coarse.